Hello everyone, Arashi Kitsune here. As anyone who spends more than 5 minutes around me can tell you, my brain occasionally draws some strange conclusions. As I was working on my Sky Factor world, trying to get the chickens to cooperate, it popped into my head that the chickens in this mod pack are an interesting representation of Mendelian genetics, otherwise known as Mendelian inheritance. This overreaching concept covers three laws proposed in 1865 and 1866 by Gregor Mendel. Now, Mendel was an Augustinian friar and abbot of St. Thomas Abbey, as well as a scientist, whom was recognized posthumously as the founder of genetics. His work involved testing characteristics in pea plants, including height, pod shape and color, seed shape and color, and the flower position and color. Now, stepping back a bit, some of the original theories surrounding inheritance include the blending theory and the homunculus theory. The blending theory states that characteristics were mixed in each generation. For example, if a dark-colored dog and a light-colored dog were bred, it would result in offspring that were intermediate in color. If this theory held true, then the organisms would become more alike each generation. The homunculus theory, predominant in the 17th century, stated that sperm basically contained a miniature human, referred to as a homunculus. In this theory, the sperm contained all traits for the creation of a baby, and the egg and womb were merely incubators. These theories were replaced by Mendel's work. Mendel used pea plants and focused on the characteristics previously mentioned: height, flower color, pea color and shape, pod color, and the position of the flowers on the stem. These points of focus were the plant's phenotype, or outward expression of the three factors of the genotype, part of the DNA sequence, inherited epigenetic factors, and non-inherited environmental factors. In the study of genetics, alleles are important. They are alternate forms of a gene, and there are usually two alleles for each gene, though the number can vary from trait to trait. Offspring inherit one allele from each parent, and alleles for a particular trait are located on corresponding loci on each homologous chromosome. Since diploid organisms have two alleles for each gene, the alleles can be homozygous or heterozygous. Homozygous genes are genes which contain identical alleles. Organisms that are true breeding are always homozygous for the traits to be held constant. Heterozygous genes contain two different alleles. These are the simplest forms. There are other variants such as hemizygous and nulizygous, but I'm not going to touch on those here. Traits can also be described as dominant or recessive. Dominants are generally expressed using capital letters, as in the case of a homozygous genotype, capital B, or a heterozygous type, capital B, lowercase b. In both cases, the phenotype expressed will be of the dominant trait. Recessive phenotypes will always result from a homozygous genotype, lowercase b. True breeding organisms, mentioned earlier, are individuals whom, when bred to others of the same genotype, produce only offspring of that genotype. So these would include homozygous individuals that, when bred amongst themselves, are true breeding, and heterozygous individuals are not. A hybrid is the offspring of two true breeding organisms of different strains, also called a monohybrid cross. So in this case, it would be capital B crossed with a lowercase b, or a completely dominant homozygous individual and a completely recessive homozygous individual. Anyway, since I keep bouncing all over the place, let's get back to Mendel's laws. The first law is the law of segregation, where during gamete formation, each member of the allelic pair separates from the other to form the genetic constitution of the gamete. Basically, each gamete only carries one allele. The second law is the law of independent assortment, which states that alleles for separate traits are passed independently of one another from parents to offspring, or that the biological selection of allele for one trait has no connection to the selection of an allele for any other trait. This law is more obvious when looking at dihybrid crosses, which I may or may not go into more detail on later. The third and final law, which was referenced a bit earlier, I think, is the law of dominance, which states that recessive alleles will always be masked by dominant alleles. Now, what we've been talking about now is considered Mendelian inheritance. There is non-Mendelian inheritance, which kind of covers exceptions to the rules, the first being incomplete dominance. In an experiment done with 4-o'clock flowers, a cross between a homozygous dominant red flower and a homozygous dominant white flower produced heterozygous dominant pink flowers. Neither allele is completely dominant over another, resulting in a heterozygous phenotype between the two homozygous phenotypes. A similar situation occurs in cases of codominance, where both alleles are expressed, such as some species of black and white chickens. Now, in Mendelian inheritance, genes only have two alleles. In nature, genes exist in several forms and are said to have multiple alleles. A common example of this are the human genes for blood type. Traits can also be controlled by two or more genes and are called polygenic traits. These include genes controlling human skin color. Now, if you're still watching this, then you're probably wondering, what the heck does any of this have to do with the chickens in Sky Factory? Well, in this particular mod, you can breed chickens that produce different materials. A boon for people like me who just like to leave the game running in the background while working on other things. Anyway, to start with, you can craft specific chickens, which are the basis for future production, including red, lapis blue, yellow, green, black, white, log, flint, and sand. There are other tier chickens that are craftable, but they are also breedable as well, so I'm just sort of going to leave them out in this train of thought, at least in this initial part of the train of thought. This also kind of ignores the assumptions that the chickens are all either hermaphrodites or are capable of asexual reproduction since they can produce viable eggs. Actually, they would be hermaphrodites since you have to crossbreed them to produce higher tier breeds. Discussion for another day maybe. Anyway, so let's take a lapis blue chicken and a red chicken. When you create the eggs, they can have one of three different genotypes: homozygous dominant or recessive, and heterozygous. Assuming the simplest case and the phenotype is only controlled by one gene. So for the sake of this theory, let's discard the homozygous recessive. Anyway, if both chickens are homozygous dominant, when bred, they will produce only heterozygous dominant individuals that display incomplete dominance for purple, which doesn't really match the actual production in the game, nor do combinations where one is homozygous dominant and the other is heterozygous, which would just produce purple in the breed that is homozygous dominant. Now, if both are heterozygous, there is a 1-to-1 ratio where there is the production of purple, red, and blue eggs. There would also be a random heterozygous recessive produced, and I'm not sure if that would be a case of codominance, incomplete dominance, or what. My brain isn't thinking that far back in my schooling. Either way, if the phenotype is only controlled by one gene, then I think the system would fall apart somewhere after tier 2 or 3. I think. I haven't thought out all the scenarios for tier 3 or up. If anyone really feels the need, I would welcome the discussion. It's more likely that the trait is polygenetic, but again, it's all computer programs, so you can make it do whatever you want, and it doesn't necessarily have to follow the laws of rational genetics. Anyway, on that note, this is Arashi Kitsune signing off.